So, Aaron French, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thanks for having me back again.
We are going to be having a discussion about UFOs and UAPs. Now, almost the forewarning about this discussion, and also the why, is that as many people will know who are, but also it will be UFOs, UAPs, also in relation to esotericism. So many people who are interested in esotericism will know of books like Jung's on UFOs, or will know about loose connections between all these phenomena, and various books that touch on what do we really do with these close encounters, what do we do with these experiences in light of esoteric knowledge. And one reason we're having this discussion is because as we move from the era of sort of a separation where you had the UFO phenomenon on one hand, which was also adjacent to a lot of sort of American countercultural stuff, and then on the other hand, you had esotericism. As we move through to this sort of very extremely bleeding edge new era of UAPs, this whole area is beginning to be a bit more like grounded in a scholarly academic fashion. And so in the one sense, this is a very early discussion of what that terrain looks like. But because of that, our conversation at times will appear disparate, will appear like there will be points where we just mentioned something that is connected, but in a sense, the work hasn't really been done to fully concord all of this into a coherent whole, because the whole thing is very, very, very new. So this is off the back of sort of three things, which is a talk you gave at a Tide of Ghosts conference called UFOs and Modern Esotericism. All of these three things will be linked. A paper called Knowing Others, the new UFO esotericism of D.W. Pasulka's American Cosmic, UFOs, Religion and Technology, and also, very, very early days of this, a collection that you're editing called Religion and the UFO Phenomenon, which will be out probably, year and a half, 2 years. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So I'll hand over to you, Aaron. I mean, I guess I want to begin with, your background, what this field, why we're talking, but also any misconceptions regarding this terrain at the moment.
Yeah. Thanks for that setup too, and for the opportunity to talk about this, because as you mentioned, it's a very it's a tricky subject to talk about, both esotericism and UAP or ufology, and to bring them together, it just makes for a really it's really easy to get lost in the weeds talking about those things. And the second, so I gave the talk in like I'm new to this in a certain sense, so I'm exploring this connection. Like my work in esotericism led me more and more to take the ufology and UFO thing more seriously, especially as it gained more kind of mainstream and government attention, as it's currently going on, especially in the States. So I gave a talk at the Tide of Ghosts conference about this. The second paper you mentioned is not actually mine, but it's a paper we just read for in preparation for this. And this is a great review of Diana Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, by a couple scholars also working on this. And it's a really good kind of that. Like I know some of those, I'm friends with some of those people and colleagues with some of the authors of that. And so their approach aligns with mine a lot. It's kind of we're taking a different take on this, the UAP subject. And then the final thing is I'm working on an edited volume currently with also some of these authors are in there, and it's called Religion and the UFO Phenomenon, Methodological Challenges. So this book is actually trying to challenge academic methodologies through the lens of the UFO phenomenon. And Jacques Vallée is the one who came up with this idea, call it the UFO phenomenon. And now so I went with that because I like it because it's very broad. And so we're kind of exploring like how does taking this phenomenon seriously, on the one hand, how does that interact with established academic methodologies? How does it challenge them? And also, when you go to do the research, how does it disrupt them? Do these methodologies actually work? Especially if you're doing like field work or ethnography. Do you have some weird experiences, as a researcher? And what do you do with those? Do you chuck them out? Do you work them into your research? Things like that. But it's also, in a certain sense, a little bit more philosophical too, and theoretical, trying to challenge these more entrenched approaches and theoretical approaches, and come up with something um, new. So that's on the one side. That's kind of what I'm been doing with this, and that's why I'm thinking about it a lot and talking about it, and now and also writing about it. But in terms of well, in terms of misunderstandings about the field, or maybe false and false or negative impressions, or false assumptions, or something that one might have about this, I suppose what's going on currently is, like, the UFO and ufology was a stigmatized topic, and the whole debate about how that became stigmatized is interesting, and there's a long history there, and there was definitely some deliberate attempts to stigmatize it. So some of it just happened for some weirdness that I think we're going to talk about. Like, it got weird really quick, but some of it was also deliberately done to stigmatize this as a topic. So once you reach the 1990s, and the early 2000s, it's fully stigmatized. If you're like working in an academic sector, or in the sciences, or in engineering, or something like that. So I think that is the assumption, that this is some kind of kooky field, or some fringe thing that's trying to be currently overturned. And it's not just, it's academics, journalists, and I guess, government officials as well, and scientists working to, uh, you know, rehabilitate this term. And that's why, starting in 2017, you had this kind of shift in the terminology from UFO to UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena. This is a kind of way. This is a way to get around this stigmatization. So that's what I would say about some assumptions. That yes, there's a bunch of kooky stuff in there, which in fact I'm interested in from the past. But that doesn't mean it's not a serious issue. I mean, like, it's being taken more and more seriously, and the strange stuff, or the weirdness, I'm interested in that because I'm a scholar of religion and esotericism. So once you go into that strangeness and weirdness, you see the connections to esotericism and religion, religiosity even, religion and esotericism are both extremely strange and weird. That's weird in a good way, meaning that they, you get it, you can have new ideas, and they don't things that you find within these currents don't fit so well into established categories, and so on. So yeah, that's just a bit of an intro.
Mm-hmm. And one of the big parts of that, I mean, I guess from an academic context, is that academia is reliant on, in a certain sense, is reliant on, I guess, forms of legitimacy. And one of these, I mean, we don't need to go super into this because it's kind of pretty clear cut now, is, government disclosure, which gives it this, well, I don't know, well, now that's there, it's sort of like open season in a way for legitimacy, which then equally you end up going back and saying, well, if this has been disclosed, then it's like seeds of truth are now thrown into a ton of other things. So I guess it would be good to begin with because as you've said, you have UFOs, which then UFOs, little green men experiences, like explicitly UFOs, not UAPs, which then transforms via like the work of Jacques Vallée and others, and Communion by Whitley Strieber being a very famous book, into ufology. And this is the very, again, my date's right, sort of 40s through to the 60s era of like classic UFOs, little green men popping their head out from behind a cupboard, as per the film and the book, obviously. But then we move into UAP. So I ask you, I guess, what the difference is and how to define a UAP, which is really, the backbone of more so spiritual phenomena, it seems, as opposed to simply a material, like I was in the woods and then this ship landed, and that seems to be a pretty key difference.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're saying that, because I heard this also recently, that someone associated UAP with more spiritual phenomena than just simply like nuts and bolts craft, or like like a Newtonian or physics or a hard sciences idea about what this is. And I think that that's true. But in a certain sense, they mean the same thing, and that, so like one perspective is that they mean the same thing, and UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena, was simply swapped in in order to, get out of this quagmire of stigmatization and to have grant more legitimacy to the topic. Looking back, because I put this phase, but with the UAP phase is post 2017. In 2017, an important article came out in several New York Times, Washington Post, and I think Politico, detailing this secretive, private, or at least classified group that was still studying UFOs within the Pentagon. And the argument was like, well, actually, the government in the U.S. had still been funding the study of UFOs after the Condon Report and Project Blue Book, which was like, at least on the kind of official history books, that was the end of government interest in it. And they concluded there's nothing here worth studying. So that was like the reason why it was such a big deal. It was like, oh yeah, they were actually still doing it in secret, according to this article. And it introduced this new terminology of UAP. So on the one side, it's kind of like, oh yeah, so looking back, you can see that, yeah, that term was introduced really to be able to grant it legitimacy, and also that it can be used in writing legislation and used kind of within government bureaucracy, basically, because since then, a lot has happened within the Congress, and there was a UAP task force set up, and this has become ARROW, which is this sort of Office of Anomalous Phenomena. I can't remember the exact the acronym there, but it's the ARROW is also a place within the government where people can report, like military personnel and so on, can report anomalous experiences or footage they have or something. There's now an organ within the government that is responsible for finding out what these things are, instead of it just being like, oh, don't talk about that. Because I think that was partly what was going on before. Pilots see things and they're like, well, I saw this thing in the sky, and they're just like, don't talk about that. I mean, I even know pilots people who have friends who are pilots who see things flying over Europe, and they're just kind of have this, oh, they just don't say anything, if you see something. So on the one hand, yeah, that's what the UAP is doing. It's giving it this government this function within the government, even to have a different term. On the other hand, though, what's interesting is, as what you said, is that this unidentified flying object has the word object in it. So it is like a more kind of materialistic, or it's either the term, like it's focusing on an object. Like, a material structure, you would think when you hear the word object. But unidentified anomalous, well, at first it was unidentified aerial phenomena, and now this has also been changed in the last 2 years to unidentified anomalous phenomena. And that does sound like, yeah, what do you mean by that exactly? It does sound like you could even fit more stuff in there that's not physical, right? Because it's just phenomena. And it's just anomalous phenomena now. So wow, that's a pretty wide net. And I think that does actually open the door for a lot more of these other kinds of experiences, and that people have, that are not just seeing some craft in the sky that's supposedly, from not made by us and maybe from another planet. So that's, I would say, so that's like a little bit what the difference is, but ultimately there's not really a difference. But if looking at this in a historical context, I did want to just introduce a kind of like, periodization, just a very general thing to use, to think with for this, for understanding like how this developed. So you were talking about this, how these sightings of flying saucers, like in the 50s, started in the late 40s, and the 50s and 60s become like proper ufology, and then we have the UAP thing. So this first phase is there's definitely a Cold War phase, and authors have written about this already. And in this Cold War phase, this is the real. A lot of this has to do with, hard nuts and bolts objects, crafts, maybe nuclear sites, because this is, so it somehow was like pegged to the Cold War crisis, in terms of how it was like experienced and manifested, and how it developed within the culture. And so I would take that until, well, basically the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that whole period is, for me, that's the Cold War period. But then you have, I think the Berlin Wall fell in 91. Is that correct? 92? I can't remember. beginning of the 90s. And then this, I would say, is the post-Cold War phase. And here you have things like X-Files becoming like a mainstream show
Yeah.
in which all of these ideas were part of the show, but they were also like both entertainment and true somehow. Like this is what the 90s did. Like the 90s started where we currently find ourselves, of this like smashing this sort of media entertainment, but actual factual aspects of history and of the present, like together somehow, like making, reality TV comes out of this. So, and like the Blair Witch Project film for like this, these the whole films where it was like found footage, but it was not, I mean, obviously there were examples of that before, but the 90s, that became a big part of like the culture, So I want to call this the post-Cold War phase. But then you have 9/11. And 9/11, in my opinion, changes this. So then you have a kind of post 9/11 phase. And the post 9/11 phase, it doesn't go away, but it really seems to take a back seat to politics. And that's because you have, well, the war on terror thing. And then you also have like the Occupy Wall Street movement in here. So it was like politics came to the center. Some important things did happen in there. In fact, there were some important things that went on in there. So I'm not discounting that period. I'm just saying that within the terms of like the mainstream kind of the zeitgeist, it seemed to have a back seat. But yet at the same time, a few important things did go on, and also this like undercurrent of conspiracy internet culture was like slowly rising and growing and taking form, which was eventually going to spew like Cthulhu on the entire world. But this is like growing here in this period. So that's the post 9/11 the phase. And then 2017, it's like a rebirth. It's like the renaissance somehow of this, because you have this article published that introduces UAP. It says the government's been studying it. It gains a lot of attention, and a lot of academics and scientists and government officials take an interest and sort of, latch onto this this train as a way to as a form of legitimizing something that one really couldn't study before, and especially not get funding to study it. So that's just a little breakdown of like where we are now, and now we're in this UAP phase, which is all that other stuff is still there. That's what's kind of there's kind of tension here, but then you do have this like very new, this very new form of studying it and very new attention. It's kind of like meet the same boss, or meet the new boss same as the old boss. There's a little bit of that going on, because this has all kind of happened before, but at the same time, I would say there are new things happening that are interesting and exciting that also haven't happened before.
Yeah. So one thing I want to say off the back of this is really look at this progression. I guess in a like a macro historical sense, like a Spenglerian sense. That's not going to complicate it, but when we begin at the Cold War phase, because as per the title of the book that you're editing, Religion and the UFO Phenomenon, it seems to me, and we should say we recorded this conversation once before, so this isn't a fresh insight, and the conversation blew up, so we're re-recording and it will work this time.
Yeah.
But in the case of religion and the UFO phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon itself, as we could say, religious historical entity, is following much the same cycle as whatever world religion you want to put, because begin with like the Cold War phase, which is the very sort of strict religiosity of a lot of people coming around. What's the most famous one? Boswell? Or we could say that this is a very like clear-cut, almost dogmatic, information-based, the religious period, which then schisms out with the X-Files into various sort of, you have Valet, you have various thinkers. Post 9/11, this religion becomes more of a political entity than it is a sacred one. And then we go, as per Nietzsche and Steiner, go into like a singular era where individuals are, I think of the various people who've had like their own individual encounters that have then relayed them. And it seems now like we're almost strangely, very quickly, in a second religiosity, as per Spengler, where I think the most interesting thing about that is, and it really shows in the fact this work is happening, is that not only is the Renaissance, as you said, a rebirth, but it's a known rebirth. So it's like we know we're re-entering this and we know we're approaching it. So we're a bit more confident in Like we can look back and reemerge. So, it's interesting to see and I think maybe that's where the gap opens for people to be a bit more sympathetic, to widen the spectrum of what UAP is and say, well, let's include other experiences that might be, esoteric. And, as I was writing it down, I did think actually a lot of people would say that prior to the religious phase of religion, there's the primal phase. And I think this is probably there in ufology by people who would have immediately said, like, these are shamanic entities, right? Like in the early days would have said, no, you just had an encounter with something that has always been around, an egregore,
Right.
or I don't know, some
Yeah.
age old,
Spirits.
some old
Yeah.
age old ancient spirit. So
Mm-hmm.
the primal is there also, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And so it's interesting to think about how religion and the UFO topic have also evolved together. But esotericism, I mean, another thing that we didn't mention at the beginning is I wrote an article on Steiner and Rudolf Steiner and J. Allen Hynek. And J. Allen Hynek was one of the one of the most pivotal figures in the development of ufology. He straddled these periods in a certain sense, even though, well, no, he did straddle them, yeah. And he was working for Project Blue Book, which was the first government Cold War period effort to figure out what this was and whether or not it was real and whether or not it was a national security threat. And he was an astronomer, he's a quite well-known and established astronomer, and he also worked with the government on developing different kind of satellite tracking technologies and stuff like this. But he was also, charged with this to work for this project Blue Book to interpret these reports. And he did do a lot of things to debunk them. I mean, that was kind of his task. Like, okay, then what's this? You get the file, figure out how was this real or not, or was this just like someone saw something in the sky and thought it was this, but was really just some weather phenomena or something like that. So he spent a lot of time doing that, and then very famously, this ended with the Condon report, which basically was like a scientific committee put together to like get to the bottom of this. Like, should we keep looking into this or not? Is there any scientific merit to this? And the conclusion was that there is not. And so that was like the kind of nail in the coffin for supposedly, but again, like it did actually continue. But at the time, this was seen as like, okay, that's the end of government interest in that. And at this point, Hynek goes off and continues to research. He gets more interested in UFOs, and he, according to the story, he kind of changed his view on it a little bit and got more and more convinced of its reality. And he also had a friendship with Jacques Vallée, who, like, the two of them are like, there would be no ufology without the two of them. So they're super important, and they have really interesting and ideas about this at a time when it was not really what people were supposed to be studying with like legitimate scientists and so on. So the 70s are a really important point in which the weirdness starts to creep in more, and weirdness in the sense of like psychic, esoteric stuff. That's what I mean by that. And so, for example, you had a moment in the 70s in which parapsychology started to, become a thing a scientist could look into. I mean, this is on the back of the 60s, and people like Feyerabend and Anything Goes, his famous famous saying about science, this kind of anarchist science, anything goes. And there was this interesting moment in the 70s in which parapsychology there was like this attempt to take it seriously, and there were some books, studies on this, and you had like Uri Geller, and these kind of like, remote viewing is being funded at Stanford at this period. There are these techniques. So in that milieu, where there was like this, there was a door open to let in psychic stuff too, into the scientific I mean, it was always there in whatever the popular sphere and the religious sphere. We're talking about in the scientific community.
Mhm.
And so Hynek and Vallée, they would continue to study UFOs with other academics and scientists in secret. And they called, it was sort of a joke, but it was actually serious. They called their cohort of scientists the Invisible College. And Vallée wrote a book talking about this. So they continued to study it basically in secret. And the 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 reference to Invisible College is to the Rosicrucian movement, because the Rosicrucian movement was also called itself the Invisible College. And so, and Hynek explicitly says that's what he's referring to. So it seems like, okay, maybe he was just making, an interesting historical connection or something, but he did start to, both he and Vallée working together did start to, and Vallée, of course, is very interested in esoteric topics and religion. And so they did start to like bring in more of this religion and esoteric stuff because they knew about it. And so I wrote an article talking about this because in Vallée's, in the biography of Hynek that came out recently, and also in Vallée has now published his journals, going back to the 70s. It's like 6 volumes, I think now, called Forbidden Science. And in there, he talks about the conversations he and Hynek had during this whole period. There you learn that Hynek was interested in esotericism since he was a teenager. When he was a teenager, he would spend his money to buy esoteric books, and his friends kind of made fun of him, for example, because he spent a bunch of money on Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings, which is this. Now they have a paperback, but they didn't have a paperback back then. You can only get this big thing, which is beautiful, but he bought that. But he never talked about it. And at some point in his esoteric, he was a scientist, but also into esotericism. And somewhere along his esoteric reading, he found Steiner. He kind of moved through some other figures who are kind of known in this I guess in this genre, and he eventually found Steiner. And in Vallée's, I think you find this in Vallée's notebooks, that he said Steiner was the one that was most interesting to him because he seemed to be working on new models of science, and that's what Hynek was trying to do. He was trying to figure out a model of science that could incorporate what they were coming into contact with these reports about UFOs. So it was almost like, it's not that something isn't happening, or these people are all just, don't know what they're talking about. It's almost like our scientific methods cannot encompass it. And so he was instrumental, and Vallée too, in starting to move in that direction to this invisible college. And like I said, that was in the 70s. And that is like basically what's going on now. So it's interesting that if you kind of leapfrog over the 80s, 90s, 2000s to 2017, you find that, now actually, and actually there, maybe there's something to that it's actually a methodological issue is part of the problem. And that has to do with what has also happened in the same period here, is developments in science and scientific advancement has just continued. So there have been really interesting advancements in sciences in terms of biotechnology, things like this, different in engineering, different types of matter, nanotechnology, blah, 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 computers. And you also have, very importantly, the so-called ontological turn in anthropology, which was an attempt to take like non-Western worldviews seriously as an ontology, not as like some data, like really there's a different ontological experience. Well, there's a different epistemological experience, but there's a different ontology that exists. It's like a plurality of ontologies. So these things have come together and have like allowed, in my opinion, have allowed for this moment that we're seeing now, where lots of academics are jumping on this as being important and useful for what they're doing.
Well, I'm glad you brought in the ontology thing, because it's key, and I'm about to throw a lot in, which will lead us hopefully to the different types of encounter, because I know you want especially to talk about actually summoning I
Good.
can't believe I'm saying this on the podcast, but summoning an alien. There you go. There goes. Well, actually, this isn't
That's where we're going.
this isn't stigmatized anymore, so we can summon aliens. But let me allow me to try ground that in the history we're talking about, and I want to begin actually. So I want to go all the way back to someone's work, such as Gregory Shushan, who writes a lot about near-death experiences, and basically just briefly mention that the correlation between, we could say, ontological cultures that people are born into and are of, and the near-death experiences that they have a relation to that culture. So it's not like if I had a near-death experience and I saw Jesus, it'd be a surprise that I had the experience, but the figure and the figure of the experience wouldn't be that much of a surprise to me, being from the West and having Christianity as my culture, maybe you could argue. But equally, if it was like, I had near-death experience and it was Thor, I would, probably one of my first questions will be, well, why him? Like, why is he there? Which brings in the Jungian question. But this, I think, ties into really the alterations of ontology, or the alteration of it's the excuse me. Right now is the emergency test alert for the UK to ring out.
Oh no.
UFOs. It's gone. I'll have to edit that out. Apologies. So the alteration, or you could say, the change of consciousness of someone, it does bring forth the spiritual question of whether or not what people are seeing is in the same sense, maybe Mary appears to certain people who are devout Catholics when they're younger, such as Lourdes. Is it such that the culture of our day is one where, you grew up with the X-Files, and so what appears to you in these spiritual moments of fragmentation is an alien? But moving that forward more specifically into the esoteric is, I would say, both Gurdjieff and Steiner. So we've spoken about this before with Gurdjieff's movements. Not too many people know this, but you sent this to me, and it is known but not often explicitly mentioned. The Gurdjieff movements, if you draw a grid on the floor where you're doing the movements and overlay something alike John Dee's tables, the movements of the group is drawing out the name of an angel and is arguably summoning an angel. I believe there's something very much the same in Steiner, but of course they're the consciousness, you could argue. The spiritual consciousness is one that is focused on, the explicitness of what we'd say like traditional spirituality, an angel, a spiritual being, not an alien. But then you might move through to someone such as the probably the most famous case of an alien in spirituality, which is Lamb, and Crowley, and having this encounter, and then through to the work of Kenneth Grant, who is then arguably explicitly summoning aliens via his esoteric work. And so one thing you actually said that is of real importance, I think, that underlies the whole conversation, that sounds very asinine, is something is happening. Right? The whole of this whole thing, esotericism and UFOs, the basis of both is that they're both connected by the fact, well, look, something happened, something appeared that is completely anomalous. And if you're attending to it via the consciousness of spirituality, and if you're attending to it via the modern consciousness of ufology, then what effect does that have on the outcome? What is your unconscious speaking for you? I mean, is it time to include aliens in Jung's collective unconscious? But I know you want, I've thrown in there both Gurdjieff, Steiner and Lamb, and I know you wanted to bring in these grades of close encounter, and the fifth, I believe, being okay. I'll let you articulate this.
Yeah,
Please keep listening to the podcast. This is
no, that's all great, and that's definitely all relevant to what we're talking about. That this esotericism and ufology, there's a connection that is difficult to track a little bit, and it's also difficult to talk about because of this stigmatized element. So I think part of why ufology got stigmatized as well was because it's overlapping sometime with this esoteric New Age stuff. It's not properly scientific, and yet now, as we were just talking about, there's something about it that requires some of these, different models of science to even be able to, or different academic methodologies in order to even be able to approach this in a scientific way. So maybe some of that was not so far off, I guess, is it's a little bit the conclusion that we're might be coming to at some point. Or but yeah, so Hynek, there's several things there. So you talked about Gurdjieff. Let's see if I can put this together. So Gurdjieff has a connection with, let's just go through some examples: esotericism and ufology. Gurdjieff has a connection to the story of Whitley Strieber. And so Whitley Strieber is not the first individual to have reported an abduction, contactee experience. This started already in the, I believe in the 1950s and 60s. This was already happening. One of the most famous ones is the Benny and Barney Hill story, and there was a movie made about that in the 70s, and they went, like Strieber, they went through this hypnotherapy to remember more details about what had happened to them.
Is that the in the sky? What's it called?
No, that's a different one. The Fire in the Sky, that's a bit later.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, that's a 90s the post Cold War, although that happened during the Cold War period, but the film has that X-Files flavor to it, that 90s flavor. But so Strieber was part of a working Gurdjieff group, and he was doing Gurdjieff practices when he had his experiences of what he calls the visitors. And he kind of realizes, he reports in this book. The book came out in 1987. We're talking about the book Communion, which like blew up the whole contactee quote alien quote unquote abduction narrative. Now there were lots of people who have stories like this, and they refer to themselves as experiencers, usually say contactees, but quote unquote alien abduction in 1987, which is right at the end of this Cold War period, the tail end of it, that becomes a much more like widespread part of the scene, the ufology scene, even though it was always there. But as I said, that book, he talks about how he figured out that by doing these Gurdjieff meditations, these visitors would show up. So even in that book, it's already esotericism is there. And he's talking about tarot cards in that book. He talks about initiation. So it's an esoteric book as much as it is about UAP or UFO experiences. And the other thing that you mentioned was about Lamb and Parsons. Well, no, I want to bring in Parsons. You mentioned Lamb and Crowley. I want to bring in Parsons because Parsons was also, it's not anything to do with Lamb, but he was instrumental in the development of the United States rocketry and space program. And he was a magician in the Crowleyan vein. And when he was doing his so-called Babylon working with L. Ron Hubbard in the desert, they were doing this Enochian magic, but he came to believe they were in contact with interdimensional or extraterrestrial entities. And in terms of Lamb, this is something that Crowley, and this is a bit debated where this comes from, but let's just go with like the mostly accepted version, I guess, that Crowley was doing some magical workings also, and was in like a kind of trance state and had the vision of this being that spoke to him, and then he famously made this image of it, and the image looks like the now iconic gray alien
from
that you also find on the cover of Communion, which is like this egg-shaped head, little body, the grays. And so that's an interesting cultural resonance, in my opinion. There's a kind of entanglement happening there between esotericism and ufology that it's like a hybrid. I'm interested in hybridization here in sort of Bruno Latour's sense that here we see two things that are supposed to be separate. Like UFOs over there, UFOs is science, right? Like ships from another planet. Because we're in this universe, we live on a planet, there's a billion planets. And so that means we have technology, they have technology, we're all evolving, so they could have a ship and come here. That's science. And you have esotericism, which is like summoning angels to speak with them, Enochian magic. These are like supposed to be separate somehow, but here we see them entangled into a kind of hybrid form. That's what I'm interested in. I think you also see this with Steiner and Hynek, which you could go more into that if you want. And with Lamb, for example, and Parsons, the Parsons and Crowley, and Parsons' interest in Thelema and the magic workings he was doing, that's also this kind of hybridization. But the Lamb, like mythology, I guess, that does get taken up into first Parsons is thinking, not in connection with Lamb, but thinking he's having contact with these extraterrestrial entities. He was very much a proponent. I mean, he's instrumental in us even going to space, and he was a huge proponent of human beings going into space. Like that's what he was interested in. Um, but you then have Kenneth Grant. Kenneth Grant ended up with that picture, and he definitely brought in this sort of alien mythology into that. And also Michael Burdio uh, also has this same view, as far as I know, that you can, at the highest levels of his like initiation system, you come into contact with an extraterrestrial, this Lamb being, for example. So here are just some interesting resonances between these two things, where you see them just like entangling. Like there is there is a history here. But to go back to Hynek real quick, just to bring this in, because we're going to go into, okay, so summoning UFOs is normally what happens in esoteric context, but also these are some scientists are doing it. And Hynek was not doing this. Hynek was interested in psychic phenomenon. So I'm not putting him in here, but he's part of this history, and his interest in Steiner and esotericism is important. And so he came up with the close encounters schema, and it's close encounters of the fifth kind that we're going to get to, because that's the summoning human initiated contact. So it's quite famous, well known, but let's just run through it. So close encounters of the first kind is seeing a ship, seeing some lights in the sky, seeing an object. That's close encounters of the first kind.
You had one of them last night, didn't you?
And I had one of them last night preparing for this thing, which is we won't go into because that's esoteric. The second close encounter of the second kind is an up close encounter where there's some physical effects, like maybe like you see like some burnt grass from where it was, or there's some physical trace left behind. And the close encounters of the third kind is when, like the movie, when you have the beings show up, and animated entities are in the craft, and maybe you encounter them and have an interaction with them. And so this movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind by Spielberg, Hynek makes a guest appearance in the film, and the main character is based on Jacques Vallée in this film. But that was where he left it at. But after that, once you had more and more of these experiencer accounts, and then you have Strieber's book coming out, might be a little bit later. The fourth category was added, I believe, by Vallée, but I'm not sure about that. The fourth category is the abduction or the contactee experience. So close encounters of the fourth kind is being contacted, directly taken into the ship, something like that. Whereas the third kind, I think, is more you just see them, or maybe you encounter them, but these experiences or narratives of being taken into ships and almost having like a lifelong, starting either a lifelong or starting like an ongoing, relationship with them. This is the CE4 was introduced for that, and CE5, which is which is also something that's quite interesting, and where you can really see this overlap, in my opinion, between esotericism and ufology. Is CE5 is human initiated contact, and I believe it was Stephen Greer who introduced this category, but again, I'm not sure exactly where these next two categories are coming from. And his CE5 protocols, they're the subject of one of the chapters in the book that I'm currently editing. And they're quite fascinating because they're protocols of group meditation to summon lights, orbs in the sky, so he has groups go out to do this in the desert, and they do this group meditation, and the lights appear. So that's just one example. There's more to it than that, but that's really interesting to me, the so-called CE5, because that's that's a pretty clear example, in my opinion, of religion and science just like entangled somehow there, or at least consciousness.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I want to expand on from that, actually, as you've been talking about it, is this strange emphasis between you, the trying to like look at, well, what is the differences, and why haven't these just all been collapsed into like anomalous experiences, right? Why is there still one or the other? And it seems that the ufology still, maybe with its sort of abidance by only 40s onwards, so it's imbued with a secular materialist worldview, is it seems to have a reliance more so on materialism, that there has been this like actual thing. And one I didn't bring in that is intriguing to me as an example, and it's a completely heterodox orthodoxy, So this is from Russian. This is Russian Orthodox theology of a very specific kind that isn't agreed across the board from Father Seraphim Rose, which is the toll booths or toll gates, which are 30, I think 30 or so gates that, as one dies, they have to pass through to, I guess, get to heaven. And each one, I think, is to do with a virtue or something like this. The reason I'm mentioning this is for Seraphim Rose's understanding was that the toll gates are literally in the sky, as if, not to sound coy, as if you got in a plane and flew up to a certain point in the sky, you'd find them there. Now, why this is important is each one is guarded by a spiritual being. And one of the beliefs that comes from this is that alien encounters are spiritual beings that have fallen away from the toll gates and are here. So, sort of to reduce that metaphor down and to look at what we've just been talking about, one thing that interests me with aliens is it's not just that you are meeting a material being. Because in a sense, say, I mean, it's like a fantastical example, but if there was like a replica of Earth somewhere else and they got to space technology before us and one flew here and you met them, it would be like interesting. But it seems that with meeting aliens or in these encounters, there's an implication in the word encounter that not only are you meeting a material alien being that is a literal material being, but there's a resonance that comes from that. Like you mentioned, the ongoing relationship. Like with Whitley, I think we see this most clearly with Strieber, is that from that encounter, he's kind of now holding a very strange resonance, to use a spiritual term. So it's not just a material encounter with something from somewhere else, which would kind of be a bit boring. There is some sort of energy that's given over, and we see this, I think, in a lot of the smaller. I don't want to say cults. I guess that's how most people would define them. But I can't remember the one that they met like in the woods, and they actually met the being, but then from that there comes a resonance. One thing I also should mention is that there's a few very strange little comments from a few of Gurdjieff's followers that just never really commented on, where a couple of them say, oh yeah, it was like hanging out with an alien. Like when he was walking around, it was like he was an alien being, and he was like, the way he'd look at things was like, to them, I guess it seemed like, oh, he's really attentive and he's fully there. But it was like, one of them mentions, it was like an alien being like seeing, a glass for the first time or something.
Right. It was like he wasn't from this planet.
Yeah, quite right. But I don't want I don't want to go too far that way. But so yeah, I mean but I guess the point there is that there is, for the alien thing, there's still this emphasis on materiality, which leaves a spiritual, well, what we'd call a spiritual trace. Like these people are affected and not just traumatically.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and some of them report having the technology, the material part is why I got interested in it, because it's an enchanted form of materiality. And so like sometimes these people report having some like implant, some object implanted in them. And also, especially now, I mean, this is going back to the beginning of this whole thing, I think. And this Cold War context is really important here, because that's a very rational science moment where we believed in all of that, and those like structures of logic like formed that whole period like super intensely in terms of government, military, and what was funded and what the dangers were, and so forth. But this again in the 1970s, this really begins to sort of take on different forms, at least in a more widespread way, that I find quite interesting. And but from the beginning, the idea of the craft as this kind of enchanted technology, this enchanted materiality, is there. Interestingly, the Roswell story that I think you mentioned, this happens in the 1940s, but it's basically swept under the carpet and doesn't come back again until the 1970s. In a major way, and there, part of the intrigue of that story is the debris that's found. This thing crashed, and it left behind this materials that had strange markings on them, and that this was like, and the next question is that there were bodies also found. So we'll come back to that in a second, because that's also a kind of next level. Like what I like about this is you're like leaving science somehow. I guess we go into science fiction, but is that really where it goes? Because the esoteric and the religious is like somehow hovering around all of it. So it's interesting that it tries to be contained within this scientific imaginary, but it's really it overflows it. I mean, that's what's so interesting for me about it. But the materiality is the technology part is kind of key to all this, because these are ships. These are things flying around in the sky, things we want to build and eventually did build and are still trying to build even better so that we can do this. So there's like human aspiration and technology built into this. So where did these debris, if we believe the story, where did it go? The government came and took it away. So I believe this starts in the 70s. I'm not sure if there's an example of it earlier. There might be one in the 60s already there were already in the 60s, these are like the UFO investigator was born in the 50s and 60s. And they did have books about, the government is hiding the knowledge that we have interactions with off-world civilizations. And probably in there's things about us having their craft as well. But the narrative of materiality, pieces of these craft, and then reverse engineering it, this comes through more and more into the discourse as well. And why I find that so interesting is because it's like, this is like magical objects, like we get this kind of magic technology that we don't know how it was built, but we can reverse engineer it and do things that seem like magic, defying gravity with our ships, for example. And within the post 2017 UAP phase, this is a huge part of the discussion. And a lot of these whistleblowers who have been coming out as part of this phase, who have credentials that one ought to take notice of, and also several of these are just like pilots, and they have also testified under oath, some of them, so that's also not nothing. Again, this is hugely debated because it's just a whistle. Like, where's the real evidence? But these whistleblowers talk a lot about this, these materials. So, and they talk about gifting, that they find these craft. They know areas where there's like gifts supposedly left by gifts. And what are the gifts? They're like lumps of matter of some kind that they can be tested and have been tested. Again, if we're just going with what we are reading, and these are done by scientists. So scientists, for example, there's one scientist working at Stanford who has come into contact with some of these materials from the intelligence circles and tests them, and then has found out, that they're not naturally occurring constituent parts. Like it's they're not. They're clearly a manufactured form, synthesized form of matter, that is not form of naturally occurring elements here. So that part always interests me, to be honest, because technology should be the most unenchanted thing. It's like, but in this context, it takes on something like a magical object, and it has this whole aura about it. They refer to these as metamaterials now. So that was always part of it, but it's a real big part of it now. And I just wanted to bring that in terms of what you're saying about how this kind of materiality, the science technology part is sort of key to this to the ufology, the UFO experience.
Absolutely. These gifts, does that relate to this underlying discussion we haven't mentioned yet, but from Steiner, and I think a few other people have mentioned this idea that humankind almost has this destiny, evolutionary destiny, to get off this rock. Are these gifts, do they tie in with Steiner's theory regarding this evolution?
Yeah, it's not explicit in that way. That's something I'm kind of working on. But it, like Steiner's thing was, and the Theosophists as well. I don't know if Gurdjieff exactly how he worked in evolution into his
Well,
lost.
thinking about it now, before you go on, Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, which is this sprawling 1100-page epic about Beelzebub in a spaceship called Karnak, which is, I believe, translates roughly as like spiritual temple from Egypt. The whole thing is based around various beings on planets coming back time and time again throughout history. Beelzebub is basically trying to redeem himself, and he comes back time and time again throughout human history to try help human beings kind of heal, we could say, like a lack within them where this false organ has been implemented. So as opposed to other alien stories where there's something that's been implanted, what's happening here is the beings from other planets are actually trying to help us remove what Gurdjieff calls the Kunda buffer, which is what causes us to be emotional and start wars. And in this sense, if we want to consider them alien, or alien beings, not in the sense of little green men, but just alien, Gurdjieff, with his wry kind of humor, and I think it's a great metaphor somewhere hidden in here, I always read it as that the alien Beelzebub fails, because the last time we really see Beelzebub, instead of trying to help, the last time he comes back in like 1940s France, hinting that he may very well be Gurdjieff himself, finds himself just sat in a cafe eating tin food, and he's like given up with humanity. But that is what eventually kind of redeems him, is something very cryptic book. So it's like an inversion of the typical alien story, but it's certainly there. And in a way, it's surprising that no one said, hang on, like, isn't this just an alien story that you're telling?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the science fiction part of it, we've touched on it, but that's also important to this, that there's like science fiction mysticism in a certain sense, and the esotericism, right? So, religion has its most traditionally established religions have their own tradition of mysticism, and they regulate it. In Islam, for example, or in the Catholic Church, if someone is having mystical experiences, it's regulated. It's it's examined. But outside of that context, like especially, another word we could throw in here is occulture, which is another way that one could think about this in terms of what happened, especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and so on, that the occult just became pop culture, basically, or became infused with it. But the science fiction, it's a kind of science fiction mysticism. Like, I was just thinking of L. Ron Hubbard again, and Scientology, and, that also has a component to this whole science fiction aliens thing, and he was working with Parsons in the desert. So that's kind of that is part of it, that the science fiction mysticism, this like secular, quote unquote, modern West worldview, is in which it is contained, at least to some extent. But like now, there's definitely efforts to get out of that, and it wasn't only in that context. It was just that, like, America was somehow at the heart of the development of this whole thing, but it's a global thing, and it's not interpreted or experienced the same way everywhere. There are a lot of interesting parallels that you could look at, but so esotericism, unlike religion, it builds science into it, modern science based on experimentation. Experimental science, meaning science that was validated by experimentation and modern scientific method, and so on. Like, that's what modern esotericism is famous for. Crowley talked about this, Steiner talked about it, the Theosophists talked about it. I imagine Gurdjieff talked about it as well. Like, science is somehow important. And so science fiction mysticism, I mean, it just seems almost natural that becomes kind of part of it. And evolution is also a key ingredient here. It's also a problematic ingredient, but interestingly, what you were saying about Gurdjieff's idea that this being comes back to help humanity. This is more what Steiner talked about. He didn't necessarily talk about gifts in the sense that you're finding it nowadays in these terms of these like pieces of matter to be reverse engineered and then built into new computers or something. But he talked about it more about in terms of evolution and spiritual evolution and the planet evolving. And he said, in one lecture, he makes this very clear, where he says that there are beings coming from outside of the solar system here to help us. And he says we need to be looking up to them, looking up to find them, because they're coming down. And what are they coming down? He says they're inspiring us with what he calls spiritual science, kind of esoteric knowledge or something. So that's the first thing he says, that and he makes it very clear that they're outside of our world, and they're coming from the cosmos, and they're coming to help us because we're in there's like a moment here in Steiner's cosmology where it's a little bit like with Beelzebub's tale, that it's not like guaranteed that humanity makes it. You know what I mean? Like there is like a plan, I guess, but it's also possible that we just lose and we don't make it. And so therefore there is like help coming to try to make sure that we make it. And this help, it's really interesting the way he talks about it, because and I wrote about this in my article on Hynek and Steiner, and if you search for my name and UFOs on YouTube, for example, you can see me presenting more about what Steiner said about this. But he first puts it this way, and then he goes into talking about how these beings are actually us, spiritually evolved, those of us who have made it, spiritually evolved into the future, and now coming back to make sure to help us, to make sure that we do make it, that we don't fall off the train, which is a kind of a weird logic, I suppose, but that's the way he puts it.
It's also a reworking of like the bodhisattva logic.
Right. That's definitely what he's drawing on as well, for sure. Avatars and bodhisattvas and so on. And he talked a lot about that. So yeah, and these beings, so if we can go one step weirder before, I don't know how much more time we have, but let's go one more step weirder here, okay? We're not keeping to any good schedule here anyway, so we might as well just mash it all up at this point. So I could not find whether or not Hynek and Vallée necessarily subscribed to this theory, but they kind of just threw a lot of ideas out there in their books. And one of them is this notion of time traveling, of us evolved in the future with the kind of technology that can now travel backwards in time. And maybe that's what we're experiencing. And that is also a talking point and a theory that's come back around now in this this UAP phase. And that's a little bit what Steiner is saying. Like, he also has very strange ideas about in technology, and he says that eventually minerals will just be alive. They'll be living things, and the technology will just be alive, basically. So he does have an evolution of technology with this evolution of human beings, and they are coming back to help us. So it's like not quite as framed within this scientific language or perspective. It's more esoteric, but there's a lot of similarities. But what I did find is Hynek suggesting to some people, read Steiner's books, this book. And another thing Steiner talked a lot about were just what are these beings that are coming? They're not physical. They're etheric beings. So one possibility is, did Hynek think that that these could be the etheric beings that Steiner talked about? And you do find this already much earlier, and that is in the 1945 already. So we're going to jump back a little bit to the end of the modern esoteric cult revival, right before, this is 2 years before the first sightings by Kenneth Arnold that start the Cold War phase of ufology. And this is a group that was founded in California by someone named Mead Lane. And Mead Lane was an esotericist, and he founded something called the Border Sciences Research Foundation, I think is what it kind of changed its name later to Border Science Research Associates or something like that. And he also had a psychic working with him. He founds this thing to study in California, and he to study, quote unquote, border sciences. And within this context, he was already talking about beings coming here in ships that he said were etheric ships. And he said these were etheric beings coming here in these etheric ships. And he called them the Etherians. So he and this group, they wrote books about this. They even wrote letters to the government that are now declassified. You can read them, saying this is after 1947. This started to become a whole thing within the culture, and they were part of this, just with this way more esoteric view, thinking these were etheric beings coming from Etheria, the Etherians or whatever. They wrote letters to the government asking them, begging them not to shoot them down. So And this is interesting because out of that California wackiness, you do find like John Keel and Raw and even Leary, like they all kind of maybe reference this group at one point or another. So it has a sort of background influence that I think is quite important. For me, I see that that's one area where the esoteric is jumping over into ufology, which got it into a lot of trouble later, and the stigmatization. But here we have the etheric being, the idea of these being etheric beings, or like now we would say plasma beings. I do think Hynek may have entertained that.
Hmm. Then shoot them down. It's funny.
Yeah,
How would you shoot down Rick ship?
it's a good question.
Cloudbuster.
Well, see, that's the last part of that. Well, that's where I was going with this. Thank you for reminding me. One of the individuals who was involved with this group, I have his name here somewhere. I do not have his name, unfortunately. A UFO investigator and just writer, writing about sort of post World War II topics. Also believe this etheric ships idea. He kind of took it a step further. He wrote this book that I think was called Sky Creatures, or Living Sky Creatures, and this comes out later. But he was connected to this group and with Mead Lane and so on. And in his book, draws on Steiner explicitly. He has a chapter on there, like the etheric science of Steiner, but it's a UFO book. And in there, he makes the argument that these are just another life form. These are an etheric life form. They're not ships. And you can imagine who he's also drawing on to make such arguments. And you just mentioned him. The cloud busting.
Wilhelm Reich.
Wilhelm Reich. Yeah.
Yeah,
Also had this theory about this.
And there's the Oroner experiments, which I believe are adjacent to aliens, that went really wrong. And that book there's only 2 of his books that were never republished, that he didn't allow to be republished, and that's one of them.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I mean, as you just say that, it's funny that how many modern esotericists, especially I think of Timothy Wiley, this happens to him as well with his book, E.T., Dolphins, E.T.s, and I can't remember the full name, but there's sort of their end game is an acknowledgement that this might be aliens all along. And also this idea that you mentioned of sort of coming from the future back. I think of that huge period of channelings of the Seth books, the Pathwork books. I don't want to say these are aliens, because a lot of them are explicit about what they were. Equally, like Dion Fortune channels the Cosmic Doctrine. So there's a lot of possibility to play around with there. And there's often with these channelings, people will say like, oh, it's this unnamed thing, like you don't need to know about it.
Right. Right. Sometimes it has an explicit alien name, though. Sometimes it is an alien. It's true. Like they have both,
Yeah. So
this new age, the new age, like you see, it's actually pretty present. Like when I first started looking at this, it was a little bit hard, but to find the connections. But then once I kind of back read through the history, then it's just sort of explodes, and you're like, wait a minute, it's actually everywhere. These two things are overlap. But I also think that unfortunately is where a lot of this stigma, and there is like a move now to somehow move it out of that. But at the same time, take what was good. Like some of that may have been actually useful, like thinking about different kinds of science, different psychic, different like anomalous experiences are somehow part of it too. So it's an interesting mess. I mean, I'm interested more in mostly in like the kind of cultural resonances and these instances of hybridization. I just think that that's interesting. There's not like a historical connection per se between all of these, like a link from one to the other, but there's like a clear entanglement going on that unfortunately was part of the stigmatization. But I also want to somehow highlight it as being important. Also, it's also an important part of it, and that's when I write about Hynek and Steiner. Maybe we can end with this just to make it clear. Like, I'm doing it from the perspective of, Hynek kept all of this secret because he didn't want to
ruin his career.
Yeah, tarnish his career as a proper astronomer.
And here you are.
Yeah, and here I
banging the nails in.
Right, but but my argument though is that it was precisely because of his interest in esotericism that allowed him to be able to approach something like the UFO phenomenon in a scientific way, whereas a lot of other people weren't able to do that. And that's like what they're trying to do now. They want to approach it in a scientific way, but it clearly goes beyond the limits of the sciences that we have. You know, that's if nothing else is clear, that's pretty becoming more and more clear. So that's why so many academics and philosophers and scientists and physicists are getting involved to try to open up the window, the doorway, you know, to get more approaches in there. So that's my argument, that I think actually his interest in esotericism is what made him able to approach this in a way that was a bit ahead of its time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That all makes sense. Right. Well, I did forewarn everyone that it would be disparate, and I hope people will understand why we can't kind of tie a bow. It's a good thing that we can't tie a bow on it at the end, because it's a very open domain.
Still happening, yeah. It's still developing anyway, so there's no bows to be tied yet.
So a good place to begin is the three that the two things we mentioned that will be linked, and then in a year, I assume in a year or so, will be your own book, Religion and the UFO Phenomenon, and maybe we'll have another discussion around then. Is there anything else you want to add or throw in?
No, I think that we probably covered enough there. But if you want to know more, just check out my article. Is published in Duskata Annum on Hynek and Steiner, and then I have some presentations on that I gave at conferences that are up on YouTube at various places.
Cool. I'll be sure to link what I can. Okay, Aaron French, once again, thanks very much.
Thank you.